This Friday, we are doing Install Fest. Does anyone not know what Install Fest is? Uh-huh. Quiet from the peanut gallery over there. So, we have a rare opportunity to give you an option. For Install Fest, would you prefer Subway or Panda? So let's see a show of hands for Subway.
Can we have some time to think about it?
No. Let's see a show of hands for Panda. Alright, we have a clear majority. So we're going to be doing Panda. That's going to be $10 each. No, just kidding. So that's this Friday. It starts at 6. I forgot to mention that in the email. So please do not show up here at 3 or 5 because no one will be here. Or a class. It'll be interesting. You could probably teach them about Linux though. So here at 6, make sure if you are dual booting that you have defragged your hard drive beforehand. If this is your first time installing Linux, I recommend that you do not dual boot. I recommend that you do a VM. If you don't understand what that means, you can ask anyone of the e-board and they can explain it to you. So, then the weekend after that is Scale, for those of you going to Scale. So that's exciting. And then the week after that is going to be ALSYS. ALSYS is our Advanced Linux System Administration Seminar. So basically we're going to be covering more advanced topics. And when I say advanced, I mean you've installed Linux and you've used it before and now you're ready for some advanced topics. Nothing really strenuous. So please do not be scared off by the title. However, it is RSVP. So send me an email if you want to go. I know it's a couple weeks away, but it sure would be nice to have a list. So that includes the e-board. Thank you very much. March 7th, on Thursday, MISA, who many of you know is sort of our partner or sister club that meets in this room on Thursday. They're not in this room anymore. It's actually over in the College of Business now. But they meet on Thursdays, is having a company come out that does distributed cloud services. And they are highly interested in having SWIFT attend that talk because I believe they're looking for people for the summer. So if you're interested in doing any sort of technical computing or cloud service providing, or maybe you just need a job, make sure you show up to that. So again, that's March 7th, which is a Thursday from 12 to 1. And I do not remember exactly what room it's in. But because it's MISA, you can go on their website and look all those details up yourself. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Marcus, or as we know him, airen. He used to be president of SWIFT and is now pretty much living the dream. Working for so I'm going to let him tell you about his background if he so wishes, but give him a big round of applause.
So, as Zach said, you may remember me from this exact club. I was president a while ago for a brief period of time until I had some issues, left, and then got a job where I'm working now. I was also on the CCDC Blue team as part of the Unix team, and we won regionals the year I competed. Didn't win nationals, but that's the way things go. So, today my topic is GNU/Linux system security. And I'm about to show you one of the most secure computers that you can access. That's my server, and that's where my slides are. And there's network error in the data center right now. So that computer is down. It's extremely secure because you can't connect to it. The most secure computer on Earth is off, buried in the middle of a desert surrounded by Marines. That's not a very useful computer. And so, in my day-to-day work as a security engineer for a medium-sized web hosting company, you have to balance security and usability. Because as you can see, this extremely secure computer right now isn't terribly useful for me or anyone else. So, there are a few basic steps that you can go through in order to take the security of a system and make it your priority, while at the same time maximizing the usability of the system, because those things go hand in hand. For instance, I don't know what's going on in this data center right now. I don't have contact with the host, not where I work, somewhere else, that I had before I worked at my previous job, my current position. So I don't know if we're under a denial denial of service attack. I don't know if they were hit by some type of malicious software injection. I don't know what's going on there because I don't have any contact with them. So obviously security has a balance to be achieved with usability, but it also affects usability. Anyway, being that I do this every day, most of this is floating around up here, but it may not be as organized as it otherwise would have been. So one of the first concepts that's really important to this sort of thing, especially if you're talking about, well, either a workstation or a server, is reducing your attack surface. So who here has heard about recent Java exploits? Anybody? Yeah. So obviously, if you don't have Java installed, that's not going to be a problem for you because your attack surface is lower. You don't actually have that interpreter, the Java virtual machine, that has the vulnerabilities that are being exploited. So if you don't have it installed, it can't be attacked. Again, that's a usability and security balance thing because if you don't have a lot of stuff installed, it won't be terribly useful. But for things like web servers, you need to take into account what kinds of language interpreters you have installed. For example, Ruby, which also had some recent vulnerabilities related to its parsing of objects, or compilers, for instance. Can anyone tell me why a compiler might be a security vulnerability? Anybody? Nobody? Okay, so let's say someone gets a shell on your server through some means. Say your web app was compromised or you got your password brute force or something like that. If you have a compiler on your server, it can compile programs. And these programs can do several things from creating backdoors to creating botnets, proxies, all sorts of stuff that you don't want them to be doing. So it's a concern with usability and security. So you have to determine what the purpose of your server is, what the purpose of your workstation is, and balance those two things accordingly. So reducing your attack surface is an important thing. Throughout the talk, I'm going to refresh this and hope that it comes back up so I can have my slides. I think I have some notes on my laptop as well, so I can boot that back up. So that's one of the things that's a big concern. The other thing, or another thing that's a concern, is that these computers are connecting to the internet. That's one of the big reasons why they're useful, is the fact that they connect to the internet and they can exchange information over it. So you have to control what information is being taken from and going from your server. This is primarily done through, can anyone answer? Firewalls. So firewalls are devices that allow you to control access to certain ports, well, for something like NetFilter and IP tables, certain ports of the machine. There are other firewalls that exist. There are things like ARP tables, which is useful for protecting against ARP spoofing, and that's part of the Linux kernel. And there are things like mod security, which is an Apache, and now I believe it's an Nginx IIS as well, which is a layer 7 firewall for HTTP requests. It's a web application firewall. These things are useful in protecting what can talk to either your link layer or your application layer or your device layer. So when you use something like a firewall, like IP tables and NetFilter or ARP tables or mod security, you are controlling what's talking to what. So for instance, if you have a web server and you've got, say, Apache on it and it's talking on port 80, and this web server doesn't do anything else. All it does is serve web pages over port 80, not secure web pages or anything like that, just web pages, static web pages. That machine should only have port 80 visible from the outside. Everything else should be locked down. There's absolutely no reason that anything else should be open. Now, if this is remotely administered, perhaps you want port 22 open for SSH, the secure shell, which is popular for doing things like remote administration. That's what I use. Now, so using firewalls allows you to do that sort of thing. IP tables has a lot of tricks in it. There are several modules that it has, something like contract, which tracks connections within a kernel, within a hash table, I believe. Right? Yeah. Pretty close, yeah? Yeah. Anyway, and so you can do things like say, hey, if this connection is established, then it can do these other things. Or you can rate limit, you can do all sorts of stuff with it. But the technical part of that, the actual implementation details aren't that important because you can just go on Google and find tons of people that have already posted things about that, and you can look at it yourself. It's the knowledge of knowing that you can do these things and you should do these things that's important. So, let me see here. I'm going to grab some notes because I'm starting to lose track of my thoughts. Still down. Ah, there it is. So another thing that is important is permissions. Have any of you installed anything on Linux and you couldn't get it to work because of a permissions problem? Anybody? Yeah. How did you solve that, Zach?
Windows. Yeah.
777. Okay, so some of you guys know where I'm going with this. Chmod 777. So Unix permissions are for the user, the group, and other, also known as world. So 777 is the bit mask that says everyone can read this file, write to this file, and execute this file. The group can do that, and the user can do that. There is a common tendency for certain users to say, hey, it fixes the problem because, you know, the permissions aren't correct, and this fixed it. Obviously, that's bad, especially if you have something that's internet-facing, because at that point, you're allowing anybody, any user on that machine, to execute code or to read anything or write anything. There was a recent problem with GitHub. I don't know if any of you guys heard about that, where people were uploading their SSH keys and their, you know, config files and things like that. Had they had those particular files not accessible by their user, which they may or may not have to have them accessible by the user, that wouldn't have been a problem, because when they did their git commit, it said, oh yeah, I don't have permission to access this file. So permissions are extremely important. And they're not that hard. A lot of people trip up on things like that, but once you delve into how Unix permissions work, it's not an extremely complex concept, but it is something that takes a little bit of getting used to. A lot of people trip up on the bitmask thing, so the 777 or 755, which is where you don't allow the group to execute, you don't allow others to execute, but they can both read and write. There is another syntax for that. You can say U plus RWX, O plus RWX, and G plus RWX, or A for everyone or all. So it seems kind of intimidating sometimes, but it's not that bad. Again, the implementation details aren't the most important part, because that's simply reference. It's keeping in mind that you want to have a philosophy of least permissions for everything possible. And that way you're, again, reducing your attack surface and reducing what is available to someone that may potentially gain access to your system. Another point in this regard is POSIX ACLs. They are like permissions, but they're more fine-grained. So a POSIX ACL, you can actually define specific users, not the user yourself, which Chmod refers to, but you can define specific users or specific groups to have those same Unix permissions, but at a finer grained level. So if you don't already use ACLs, it's something to look into. They're not super hard. A lot of people trip up on them. The only problem is that they don't work in reverse, so you can't blacklist a user from using something or accessing certain portions of the system. So another thing that's important is watching your logs. Anyone know where all the logs are located on a typical Unix system?
Var log.
Yeah, var log, obviously, yeah. So there's a lot of things that these logs contain. That's how you know what's going on in your system. It's part of your situational awareness. It's part of knowing what's happening on your system. So you can either go tail those files, or less or more, or cat if you're using cat, or do whatever you want, and just look at them, you know, like your auth log. See who's logging into your machine via SSH. See if there's any, like, someone trying to hit you a bunch of times and brute force you, and you know, brute force your passwords. So log management is extremely important. There are a number of tools available on Linux that allow you to either ship your logs somewhere else, like via our syslog or something like that. You can parse your logs automatically with things like fail to ban, and these things can do actions on their own based on the information that they're gathering from your logs. Like, say, one of the popular reasons to use fail to ban, I know Cal Poly Swift uses it on their server, because I set it up, is to stop SSH brute force attacks. So your firewall's open, you've left port 22 open because you want people to log into your server via shell. But at the same time, you're exposing that to a vulnerability of someone saying, hey, I'm going to try and log in as whatever user, commonly root. That's one thing too, you probably shouldn't allow root logins via SSH, and you should probably use, you know, either sudo or switching to the root user after you've been logged in. Anyway, let's say you don't. Let's say you allow root logins for some reason or whatever. With something like fail to ban or deny host or SSH guard, you can say, hey, if you see 10 failed logins from this IP address in this space of time, it'll insert a rule into your firewalls banning that particular IP address from accessing your machine from a given amount of time. It's very useful. But fail to ban is a lot more extensible than that. You can do other things like say, hey, I've been hit this many times, and it'll do a who is on that person's IP address, and it'll send an email to the abuse account associated with that IP address. So the ISP will actually be notified that that particular IP address has been performing some type of nefarious activity against you. No one will ever read it, but it's a nice idea. So managing your logs, looking at what's going on in your computer or your server is an important way to determine what exactly is happening on the machine itself. And this can allow you to either spot problems early on, or it will let you, and if you're continually reviewing this information, it will allow you to establish a baseline. So you can understand how your machine is normally performing, and you can detect anomalies faster. Speaking of anomalies and things like that, there's file system integrity. So there's a lot of tools out there that allow you to establish a baseline of your files. On your file system, they'll perform hash or something like that, depending on the tool, on all of your files, and it'll say, hey, if it's been changed, this hash will change, and it'll alert you if that happens. There are tools like AIDE, which is the Advanced Intrusion Detection System, OSSEC, Tripwire, things like that, that will allow you to determine if you've been broken into and if a file has been changed. So what's interesting about this is that you can also keep those records off-site. So obviously, if you have a database of the good known versions of all these files, you don't want to keep it on the same machine that you have all of those files on, because that can be tampered with. So again, it's about redundancy, something that I should probably learn with, you know, my server being down here, and having copies of things in other places, backups and things like that. Backups, you would think, maybe aren't directly related to security, but they can help you establish in a post-attack situation whether something's been changed or tampered with. So another important, let's see here. Another important subject to go over is malicious kernel modules. Have any of you guys heard about the malicious module that inserted iframes into web pages? Don't hear about that? A little bit. So, can anyone think of a way to stop that from happening? To not have malicious, so someone gains root access to your machine, or they exploit some sort of vulnerability, and they're inserting a kernel module and letting it do anything at the kernel level access. And the kernel is at the bottom of the stack in terms of, well, I guess hardware is at the bottom of the stack. But anyway, it's what's talking to the hardware. It has the highest amount of access to things. So what you can do two things. You can do what I do on my server, which is currently down, and build modules supported to the kernel. So even if they get on there, they can't load any modules into it. Or something that just came onto the scene, I think in 3.7, in the kernel 3.7, but was proposed like back in 2004, is signed modules. So you can actually sign these modules with a cryptographic key, and you tell the kernel, hey, if it doesn't match this key, don't load it. So that's another one of these concepts that is emerging, although it's been known for a while. That's important to consider, because it allows you to tailor exactly who and what is allowed to run on your system. So there's a big thing here that I'm not mentioning just yet, but I'm getting to it. Virtualization. So can anyone tell me why virtualization is an important thing for security? Go for it, anyone.
Limits what a single host can do and what it can run. So you can put multiple VMs of different services, give them all this.
Right. So what you're doing basically is you're isolating things and saying, hey, you only do one thing, you only do one thing. So in essence, you're reducing your attack surface and you're spreading it across several virtual machines. And what's interesting about that and useful about that is you also can, depending on what type of virtualization technology you're using, you can either revert that machine to a known good state, or you can access it directly through the file system, if it's, say, like a jail in FreeBSD, and do things that the container itself may not be aware of, but the host is aware of. On the other hand, if any of you know who Theo Durat is, he's the founder of OpenBSD. I think in regards to virtualization, he said something like, and I have the quote on my slides, which will be available. I'll give them to Zach and he'll put them up on the website. If you trust the people that wrote a bunch of vulnerabilities to write a more complex thing and have that be secure, you're crazy. So that brings me to another good topic, is complexity versus simplicity. So if you don't understand how these things are working, if you don't know what's going on, how are you going to know when something's not going on correctly? So having that situational awareness, knowing your systems, working with your systems, establishing a mental baseline as well as baselines, you know, with the file systems and the logs, like I said before, is an important thing. Because if you don't know the systems you're working on, there's no real way for you to establish if something is abnormal or anomalous. So working with it, you know, being committed to actually doing it is a big thing. And that's another point, is the fact that if you're not committed to the whole security thing, if you don't have an ear to the ground, if you haven't heard about the exploits I'm talking about, sure, perhaps they don't particularly affect you directly, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's a problem security-wise because you're not going to be aware of it. So awareness is a big, big problem. And again, so let's say this Java vulnerability doesn't directly affect you. Well, perhaps it affected someone else, and then their machine was compromised, and let's say this person happens to be a systems administrator for Cal Poly or something like that. And then there was malware on their computer which could potentially affect where their permissions are. So if that person has a lot of access to other machines, someone else can gain that access now because their machine has been compromised. So it's much like the internet. Well, or it's exactly like the internet because you're established along the same lines of communication. So if those lines of communication are compromised, then they're suspect. Let's see here. So a lot of people use the commonality approach, and they'll like change their SSH port to port 2222 instead of 22 or something like that. Or they'll use Nginx instead of Apache, or they'll use some odd distribution of Linux instead of something common like Debian. There are two sides to that. So the upside is it's less common, so it's less likely to be attacked. For a long time, that was the case with OS X. There weren't a lot of vulnerabilities or anything brought up against it because no one used it. So what was the benefit in attacking it? The reality of the situation is that a lot of this computer security stuff isn't, you know, a bunch of like hackers and dark rooms and that sort of thing. It's organized crime. Organized crime is a big player, and the reason isn't to gain information and things like that. I mean, there is that side of it. There's like the Aurora attacks a few years ago, Stuxnet, Flame, that's sort of like high profile, really interesting stuff. But the day-to-day stuff that people like myself see working at a web hosting company is organized crime. Not a lot of defacements or anything like that anymore, but a lot of spam, drive-by downloads, basically trying to make money by stealing people's credit card numbers, by stealing their information, or by making them fraudulently go and drive traffic to other places. And I'm not sure where I was going with that, but it is important. So, oh, the commonality thing. So, not running common software is good in that sense that you're not a widely deployed target, but on the other hand, it's not well tested. And because people haven't been trying to hit it, they may not have found vulnerabilities that existed. Which brings me to the importance of open source software in security. It's been a well-worn philosophy among the open source community that more eyeballs on the problem see more things. So if you have more people with access to the source code, they can identify vulnerabilities more quickly. And whether you agree with that or not is kind of a philosophical disagreement, but I don't know about you, I like to have access to the source code of the thing that I'm running so that I can personally audit it if I see fit, or patch it if I see fit, which I've had to do. So that's something to consider as well when you're deploying some sort of technology or deploying some sort of services, whether you personally can audit it or whether you personally have the ability to patch it. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before about situational awareness. It's something that you need to understand. You need to understand what you're deploying and what you're trying to secure before you can secure it. Otherwise, the gaps in knowledge will create gaps in security. So I know this has been kind of free-flowing and kind of not as structured as I would have liked. But there are a few other things I want to go over here. So there are more advanced topics that are available. Obviously, this is extremely broad and extremely low level as far as what I'm going over, but it's more introducing the concepts and introducing the mindset of being suspicious, being paranoid to some degree, and being vigilant. You know, always keeping your ear to the ground, always keeping your hands on the system, whether it's actually, you know, by logging in or whether it's automated means. But automation can only go so far because computers are obviously, they do what you tell them to do, and so if there's anything outside of the bounds of their knowledge, they're not going to detect it. That was interesting. So it's automation, but with a human touch. That's important. There are other advanced topics that can be applied. Things like kernel patches. There's something called GRSec, which is a kernel patch set that mitigates a lot of vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel that is not necessarily mainline, but there are some distributions that ship it. Things like Gentoo hardened or I think there was a distribution a while ago called the Unix, but I don't know if that's around anymore. There are things like PAX, which is a memory control system. It defeats a lot of stack smashing and things like that. So those are kernel patches that you can apply. There are things like GCC's SSP, the stack smashing protector. So you actually, when you go to, and this is a problem that Debian has, they don't use it, when you go to actually compile all of your packages that are based on C or C++, it actually, at compile time, bakes in protections against stack smashing and heap smashing, I think, as well. So that overflows, buffer overflows, heap overflows, stack overflows, that sort of thing, don't affect your programs. So even though the source code itself might have a problem in it, the compiler takes over and says, hey, we're going to put in a protection here and not allow that to happen. So what I'm getting at here is that there's a layered approach you want to take. There are some people that have criticized the layered approach and they say, oh, you know, product X or product Y, next generation firewalls, or this shiny thing over here is going to solve the problem. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but there was recently a company called Bit9 that had a malware problem. Anyone hear about that? I see Zach did. So they were a application whitelisting company, and their philosophy is that, hey, antivirus is broken. Signatures are pretty much dead. That was a 90s thing, you know, and it's hard to do. So instead of saying, hey, this application has been infected, we'll say, hey, this application is known to be good. Well, their servers were compromised, and a bunch of their software got shipped out compromised. So at this point, they were whitelisting malware. And they're used by a lot of government institutions. And you know, this is one of those next generation things that's going to solve everything with its silver bullet. Don't believe anyone that tells you that. Again, it's the balance of complexity and it's the balance of layering. So the layering approach. So if you have your firewall, you're watching your logs, your actual system is hardened, your tool chain is hardened, your kernel is hardened, you're going to have a better time. A lot of this is not being low-hanging fruit. So I'm sure all of you know someone that is pretty bad with computers, right? They've got like 30 toolbars on Internet Explorer on their Windows XP that is probably not a legitimate copy, and oh, you know, it goes really slow, they got pawns on anybody, whatever. So those are the people that are going to be affected. And you can take a lot of those steps that I've described now to not be one of those people. At the same time, it's important that you be vigilant for those people as well, because as I explained, they're the pivot points for malware. They're the people that are helping to spread these things. So you want to keep the ecosystem as clean as possible. So it's about being an advocate. It's about being, again, someone who's vigilant and someone who is constantly having their ear to ground. But you also have to tell people, hey, this is a problem. Because a lot of people don't know, you know. A lot of people don't care. They don't really see it as a problem until they get their identity stolen or their computer gets, you know, a bunch of malware and it's super slow. I think I had a couple of other topics I wanted to go over, but I don't. I could go over mandatory access control systems. You know, does anyone know what a mandatory access control system is, by any chance? So, standard Unix permissions are called discretionary access control. You give specific access to these things through things like groups, users, and world. Mandatory access control is something like SE Linux or AppArmor or Tomio or SMAC or GRSX RBAC. There's a lot of systems out there, and none of them work the same, although a lot of them are implemented through Linux security modules. And these systems are like more fine-grained permissions, essentially. So you will have, with like SE Linux, for example, you'll establish roles for certain applications or users, and you'll say, hey, if it's doing this particular thing in this particular area, that's okay. But if you're trying to, say, launch Perl from temp, that's not okay. So a common, like, basic, super simple Linux security thing is to say, hey, make temp non-executable. Anyone know why this wouldn't work with, say, Perl or Python or something like that?
The interpreter's not in temp.
Exactly. So the part that is actually executing is the interpreter. It's in user bin or sbin or something like that. And the file that it's reading from temp isn't executable. It's just a text file. It's just slurping that up, evaluating the code in there, and then executing it over in user. So things like that. That's just an example, though. But something like SE Linux or AppArmor could actually protect against that because they say, hey, Perl's not supposed to be executing stuff over in temp. And then that wouldn't work. So mandatory access controls are a higher level thing. I myself do not like SE Linux. I prefer GRSX RBAC or AppArmor. But there are strengths and weaknesses to each approach. Yeah, I think that's about all I have for right now. Again, let's see. Nope, still down. Yeah, yeah, I think that's about all I have. Brute force protection, I mentioned that. Alternative software. I think that's about all I have. Does anyone have any questions? I realize this has been kind of rambling and not as structured as I would have liked, but you know, this is what I have. Questions about anything?
So what is the most frequent attack that you see in sort of day-to-day?
What I see? Well, working at a medium-sized web host, the most frequent attack, okay, well, the most frequent internet problem according to OWASP is cross-site scripting. So that is the most common thing to happen on the internet is cross-site scripting. For you, those of you that don't know, cross-site scripting is something that is related to JavaScript input sanitization. So basically you can say, here's a field, and because the element that is accepting that text isn't checking for things that shouldn't be inside of that text, it will execute JavaScript code from whatever source. They can be either reflected or stored, so it can either be just in the user session or it can be stored on the server. So that's the most common thing that, that's literally the most common attack on the internet. What I see a lot of day to day, because I work with a large web hosting company that does a lot of WordPress and blogs and things like that, is a lot of PHP based. So code injections, backdoors, things like that. And so that's something that is both a fault of misconfiguration, that's a very common attack vector, and problems with PHP itself. So what I do to mitigate those sorts of things is deploy things like mod security, which is a web application firewall that can inspect the actual traffic coming to the web server and determine if it is based on signatures, whether it's malicious or not, and deny access that way. Any other questions?
What is the easiest thing a person can do to secure their web server or website?
The easiest thing you can do to secure your web server or website, it depends on what level of access you have. If it's your web server and it's a dedicated server or a virtual private server and you have root access, you can do a lot of things. You can do pretty much everything I've just outlined, and the only barrier to entry really is knowing the actual technical implementation details. If you don't have root access, let's say you're on a shared web server and you just have your users access, the number of things you can do is more limited, because with the access comes the ability to architect these things and change things. As a user though, let's say for example, if you're on a shared web server that you have with several other users, you can do things like adjusting the permissions. Like let's say you have an upload folder for your image gallery. You might not want executable permissions there. You don't want stuff to actually execute code in your upload folder because someone could upload a backdoor, shell on the server, and mess with your stuff. If you're a user, you can also restrict things if you're using Apache through things like htaccess, which is a file that determines whether it determines sort of, how do I describe it? It's determining the permissions of what the web server has access to in a certain directory. So you can say, hey, if you're from a user agent like, oh, I don't know, Googlebot or Bingbot or something like that, no, you can't access my whatever directory. Let's say you use some sort of source code management to deploy your actual web page to your server. A lot of people forget that in, say, SVN or Git, there's a complete history of your code in the .svn or .git folder. And so what a lot of people forget to do is adjust the permissions of that folder, so that when you browse to that particular website and at the domain name you type in .git or .svn, you can see an entire history of what their web server was. So maybe at some point they had their configuration details in there. And so you can go find their configuration details with something like WordPress. That might be their database user and password, a secret key, something like that. With something like Drupal, it could be much the same thing. If you have root access, again, the things I just outlined, firewalling it, log management, automation, if you have the choice of what operating system you're running, you can run something like Gentoo hardened, or you can use hardened kernels from their sources on other distributions. There's a lot of stuff you can do. But as far as the simplest thing, I think it's really just keeping an eye on it. A lot of the things that I see that get compromised every day are people that haven't logged in for a long time. And they just sort of, it's running, it works, so leave it alone. Not a good idea. Any other questions?
So you mentioned one of the best things to do is just keep an eye on it. So for log management, I know a lot of people, I actually included in this, don't check their logs daily. What would you suggest for log management?
There's a number of solutions out there. It depends on how many machines you have. and it depends on whether we're talking a workstation or a server here. But for something like a server, you can set up rsyslog, or I think, yeah, you can set up rsyslog, and it will actually send its logs to another server where you can review them. So if you had 10, 15 servers or something like that, you could set up a client for rsyslog on each server, send it to one central location, and then review the logs that way. And you could use any number of tools to actually graph these logs or something. You could use something like Unix or Nagios or something like that to actually give you graphs and alerts about certain services or systems working or not working. A lot of that is uptime related, but uptime is often related to security, because if someone has malicious access on your web server, they might be doing something to negatively affect your uptime on services and the actual machine itself. Also, where I work, we also are currently heading a project that is kind of like an open source Splunk, so it does log management. There are other things as well, I think Graylog 2, Splunk I can manage. There's lots of proprietary solutions as well. Any other questions?
What kind of things do you think were the, I guess, the highlights on your resume that kind of got you that job?
That's a great question. There are a couple things I think that really drove home the point. One of them was the fact that I participated in CCDC. The foundation that being a blue team member on the Unix team on CCDC gave me in this type of thing was invaluable. Because if you guys are well aware of what CCDC is at this point, you know, they toss you into a pod, a group of 8 systems administrators, and they have you do a bunch of things, stand a bunch of services up, and they have a red team attacking everything at the same time. And what they give you to begin with is this horrid mess, you know, taped together with bubble gum and duct tape that I'm actually setting up this year because I'm on black team. And then you have to fix that while at the same time standing up services and defending from attacks. So that, I know, was a big motivator as far as my resume went, and something that my current employer definitely sees the value in. Beyond that, the fact that I have several years of Linux experience. I have used Linux for a long time now. I'm trying to remember the year I started using Linux. I think it was 2003, 2002. So, you know, nigh upon 10 years, and in that time, not only do I use it for my web servers, but it's my desktop. It's, you know, it's what I do. I literally breathe, sleep, eat Linux. You know, it's what I do every day, all day. It's my hobby, you know. And so the fact that it is my hobby means that I'm interested in it, and I'm not just going to go home and do something else, but I'll still be involved to some degree with what my work actually entails. Beyond that, I don't know. I put NetHack in my in my applications list, but no one said anything about it. It's kind of disappointing. Any other questions? Nope. Well, I apologize again for my slides not being available. I'll give them to Zach, and he'll have both the actual PDFs and the actual text sources for the slides, so if you want to get into Beamer, you can. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. Sorry it was a little more rambling and less structured than I would have liked, but I hope you at least got some introductions to concepts that you'll find useful in going forward if you decide to either pursue, you know, a career in security or as a systems administrator or something like that, or if you just want to set up your own server and you want it to not be hacked. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact me. I'm airen over on PoundSwift. And Zach also has my contact information. And I'll be probably giving a talk over at Alsace, so you guys might see me again. Hopefully that time I'll actually have my slides and demos and things like that that are nice and pretty. Thanks again. I hope you guys learned something. And if not,